Hey friends, we love to tell the stories about the moments that change our faith. And what was that experience for you that maybe shifted your faith dramatically, changed how you see everything? Our guest today shares that moment for him when his faith moved from his head to his heart and how it just colored every aspect of his life. You're listening to Halfway There, episode number 370, Jeff Haanen and Faith in Technicolor. Welcome back to Halfway There. This is the show where we have honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience. As always, I am your host, Eric Nevins. Thank you so much for being here, downloading this episode. If you work, most of us do, I can almost guarantee you that you're going to get something out of this episode. It is going to be a good one for you. All right, before we get into our conversation today, I want to remind you, everything we do is always on halfwaytherepodcast.com. You get our show notes where you'll find links to everything we talk about, including the book we're going to talk about today and all that kind of stuff. So if you're driving, doing dishes, whatever, it's all there. And there's a link to Patreon. If you want to help support the show, the best way to do that is click that Patreon button, and we will, thank you. Some of you help with that, but then you can support with a few dollars a month, whatever works for you. We definitely appreciate those of you who do. All right, let's dive straight into this conversation. This is going to be fun because my guest is somebody I've known for a long time, but I don't know how personal, maybe so like we were classmates. And so, you know how you are with your classmates. Like, I don't think we know each other that well. And I can't wait to hear more about his story because I've been watching from afar some of his work. He's the founder of the Denver Institute for Faith and Work, which does it's an educational organization that creates content and experiences around topics related to faith, work, the economy, and modern culture, which all shapes us, right? All of those things shape us. So as soon as I saw that he had a book coming out called Working from the Inside Out, a brief guide to inner work that transforms our outer world, that definitely caught my attention and I wanted to hear it. So our guest is Jeff Haanen. Jeff, welcome to Halfway There. And I'm glad to have you here.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Eric. It's been a while since we did seminary together, but glad to catch up.
I know, right? It's always fun to see a familiar face, but then again, like you have a pretty unique name. So when I see it, I was like, oh yeah, that's great. Like I said, I was all over that because the chance to just reconnect, but also the topic, I think it's pretty interesting, right? Work shapes us, and you're kind of writing about some of those themes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been involved in the faith and work world for a long time, and I've always cared about how we can shape our world through our work. But about halfway in leading Denver Institute for Faith and Work, I think the more compelling question became, how is work shaping me, and how's God shaping me in my work? So that's what the book is about, and I'm looking forward to sharing more.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to hear a lot more about that because work has been, I could share some of my story, but I think work has been kind of it's a weird thing if you're a Christian sometimes, right? Like to think about whether or not there's value to it. And if it's not, certain kinds of work is certainly a topic I think maybe people want to hear about. But I want to hear about you. So the way we do this at Halfway There is we hear about stories because I know for sure the Institute and this book didn't come from nowhere, right? It came from your story. It came from who you are. So I want to hear your story. You're in Denver now, but where did you grow up? Where are you from?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Minnesota. Grew up right outside of Minneapolis.
Okay.
So I'm a Minnesota guy. I went to college in Indiana with my wife, and then we got married and had our adventures. So spent some time in South America, actually. Lived in Ecuador, and that was the year before we did seminary together.
Okay.
So came to Denver Seminary, and we're there for 3 years. And I worked for years in Christian education, and then eventually started Denver Institute for Faith and Work in 2012. So a little bit of background.
Okay, very good. All right, so I want to dive into some of your personal experiences growing up. Okay, so growing up in Minneapolis, now that's not the Bible Belt, but it's was it a Christian family? Was it like
it's the Lutheran Belt?
The
Lutheran with German beer. No, I mean, so I grew up in Lutheran world in Minnesota. Yeah, lots of Scandinavians, Norwegians, and Swedish, and I am one of those folks. So I grew up in a progressive Lutheran church, and I didn't have a strong faith growing up as a kid, though my parents were amazing and brought me to church. I actually had a strong conversion experience when I was about 18 years old. So it got a lot of good foundations. Now that I'm in an Anglican church, I'm kind of looping back around in some church traditions, but that was kind of where I grew up, in the land where you walk to school in the morning and your hair freezes to your head. So that's Minnesota.
Yes. I grew up in Iowa, so not terribly far.
Right.
You know, we would go up to Minneapolis for the Mall of America, of course, which everybody loved in the 80s and 90s, or 90s, whenever they opened that. So we would play up there. So that's kind of a cool place. All right. So interesting. You said you had a conversion experience at 18. Tell me about that. What was that story?
Yeah. So, I mean, my experience, grew up sort of nominally Christian, didn't have a strong experience of faith until about 17, 18 years old. I'm a tall guy, so I'm 6'5", big white guy, Minnesota, listening to rap music and playing basketball all the way of my teenage years. And I was like most kids, searching for identity, searching for myself, searching for what made me important. And I actually, in playing basketball, I had an injury to my feet. And when you're a junior going in your senior year, is kind of the big moment where you're going to take your team to state. I actually couldn't play any basketball and had casts on my feet and couldn't do anything. So it was the summer before my senior year of high school. I was in casts, and I sat next to a pool, in our community pool outside of in Plymouth, Minnesota, and I read books for the first time. So I read a couple of books on apologetics that my dad had recommended, and then I eventually read the New Testament, just out of curiosity, because that was my mind. But I had this very solitary conversion experience after reading the New Testament. I would write down all of these verses that I wanted to remember. I thought, this is very interesting. I thought this would be sort of boring and disconnected from my life, but I felt something come alive. And then in my senior year, I realized I had not only conversion experience, both with my mind, realizing that this is true, but also with my heart of realizing God knows my name. He knows who I am, and I have a foundation for the first time. So yeah, life shifted right before high school was done for me.
That's really interesting. I'm really fascinated by that. Okay, so one of the first thoughts I had when you started describing that story was it reminds me of Ignatius of Loyola. Have anybody ever said that to you? Like because he got hurt. It was in war, right? But
he got a cannonball. So I don't have that cool of a story.
He took a cannonball to the leg, but he was converted by reading. It was like a lives of the saints, right? And Life of Christ, which is kind of dramatized, not directly the Gospels, but pretty interesting, right? Kind of interesting. It was a connection anyway.
It was a little weird for me because I didn't have any like young life or youth group experience. I just read books. And so in my second year of college, went to college, I was leading Christian ministries because I had a lot of knowledge, but I remember 2 years in, I'd never prayed in a group. And I remember showing up to Bible study where people were praying out loud, and at one point I just laughed out loud, like, "Why are y'all talking to the air?" It just looked ridiculous to me. I'm like, "Oh, yeah, prayer. You're doing that thing that I know about." Okay, I'm gonna try to talk to the air and see how this works.
Oh, I love that. That's really
just my experience. My brain was way ahead of my heart, and it's actually been a lot of my own faith journey as well. And this book kind of represents. This actually book's more about the heart, but it's. I've been a slow learner. I'll say that. A very slow learner.
Okay. I want to come back to that idea. My brain has been ahead of my heart. What a statement, man. That's so, that's just powerful, right? And it maybe in some ways really sums up what evangelical Christianity in my mind, right? Mm-hmm. But it's what an interesting experience to have too, and to watch your heart kind of follow along.
Yeah, and it took a long time for me. So I read, even in college, I read all these books of Christian worldview. So Francis Schaeffer and all these folks, and then even into a seminary and early career reading, and I got into the classics and all these books, but my sort of interior world was just pretty impoverished for a long time. And I'll maybe share that story about how I got a little bit more into writing this book. But I do think you're right, Eric. I think in some ways our knowledge or our truths are very disconnected from our lived experience of the living God in our particular moment. And that's certainly been my own experience. And even in the last several years, for me, it's felt like a reconversion or going from black and white to seeing in Technicolor for the first time. So
yeah.
that's just been my own story. I don't know if your listeners can identify with that, but knowing something with my mind and then actually experiencing it in my body and in my life and in my relationships has been two different things. Different things.
Okay. Well, you're speaking my language, because that's exactly why I started halfway there, is to explain. This is why I start, right? Honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience, right? I wanted to capture some of those experiences because I believe that as God's people, we have some records, right, from God's people over the millennia, go back to the Psalms and wherever, but we don't share them all the time, right? We don't. And so I wanted to believe that God still interacts with us in ways that perhaps sometimes resemble the way they do in Scripture, but we don't talk about it because it feels weird, right? It feels like, oh, well, they didn't have science or whatever, right? Except I think that people do have these experiences. So when you talk about that contrast between head and heart and what we believe versus what we experience, that's exactly where I want to be. So I'm love that. Okay. So I love this idea. So then you went to college. Where'd you go to college?
Went to college at Valparaiso University in Indiana, which is a Lutheran school. There's a strong Lutheran connection to Minnesota and Valpo. So that's where I went to college.
Interesting. Okay. So you go to college and then how did you decide you and wife got married? And then how did you decide you went on adventures, you said? So how did you decide to go do that?
Yeah. So, gosh, we were both believers. My wife actually came to faith first year of college, which is its own really beautiful and fun story.
Oh, interesting.
We led Christian ministries and started the Campus Crusade for Christ at college. And then afterwards, we're like, hey, we're young, we're married, the world is our oyster, so let's go. So we joined a mission organization and we went to Ecuador, South America. And what we were doing there, we launched a college group. My wife had a scholarship to study at a university there. And we just traveled everything from Spanish-speaking church there to the Quichua, which is a tribe in the mountains. And we just traveled. So at that time, it's, the world is open. Go and explore and adventure. And that is another part of my story as well. Not only kind of the head of the heart, which is a part of my story, but sort of taking risks and launching and starting into things. So we then spent some time in Latin America, and that was a great experience to get outside of our cultural context. We know what it felt like to be an immigrant for a year. We knew what it felt like to miss home. And when we came back to it would be Colorado, we could identify with people that were far from home, and God had a good purpose for that, I think.
How did that shape you? So looking back on it, how did that experience of being a stranger in a strange land, as it were, shape you and your understanding of God's heart for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I would say paying attention to people. You don't always know what's going on behind them. You don't know their experience of the day. You don't know their cultural background. You don't know a lot about the person that you're interacting with. And actually, we found that time and time again is that, I can actually see a little bit more of this person's life since I've lived in their context for a while. Obviously, there's a lot I still don't know, but God pays close attention to us. And I think he's compassionate with where we've been in our lives. It could be family of origin or culture, and he knows us deeply and intimately. So I'd say that paying attention to people. God pays attention to us.
Absolutely. I love that. Okay. And then you decide to go to seminary. So you're in this missions organization, but how did you end up deciding to go to seminary?
Yeah, it's a good question. I knew I wanted to do seminary early. I had taken a few theology classes in undergrad, and I didn't like them very much for a few different reasons. So I knew I wanted to do seminary. And it was between Denver Seminary, where I ended up going, and a couple of other schools. And I chose Denver Seminary mostly for the mountains.
Yeah, right.
Just being out in Colorado. My sister actually had moved out years prior because she went to Colorado State, and we decided to come out here. But what was driving me for seminary was just curiosity. It was sort of that head above or beyond the heart thing. Like I just wanted to know. I wanted to know everything. I wanted to know about biblical languages and Old Testament and New Testament and philosophy. I just wanted to know because I have a sort of a deeply ingrained skepticism that's been there since a kid. Like, are there really angels and demons? And did they really come back from the dead? I just had that sort of ingrained in me. And so I wanted to know all the details. So that's where I went to seminary. I didn't know what would become of it afterwards, but it was just a driving curiosity. And You're young, you don't have any bills at that point, and and no kids at least at that point, so it wasn't a problem.
Oh wow.
So,
right.
Yeah, that was my story.
Those were the days, man. Okay.
Right. Yeah, times change.
Yeah, indeed. And that's a good thing, but it's fun to look back and go, yeah, that was interesting. Okay. So what I'm hearing is you went to school, or originally you went to college, and then you went and served a little bit, and you still wanted to know more, right? You still wanted to kind of dive in, and you had some more, whether they were questions or like this is that season of life where season of the journey, the faith journey, where people want to know and kind of get their ducks in a row. I don't know if that's what you were wanting to do, but kind of figure things out, right? Like, okay. And
Totally.
it tends to be really heady, tends to be like, tell me the rules and I'll just follow them. Right. Or they're kind of there soaking in all the things.
Yeah.
Is there anything? Yeah. Is that right? Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, thinking about critical journey, like I was definitely typical. Know and do. For sure. I'm going to know it, and then I'm going to do it, and it's going to be great, and we're going to change the world.
Yes.
Now, maybe that's an oversimplification, but that is definitely where it's at. And it's not to deprecate either of those. Like, we need to understand the truth.
That's
absolutely. Right. And we need to be active as well. But there was a missing part. So when I got involved in kind of faith and work conversation, that's actually what really appealed to me. As I started to learn about reform conversations about culture and about engaging culture and reforming systems and change and positions of leadership. And I thought, wow, this is a beautiful vision of theology in the world, or the gospel in the world. And the do part of it was, well, I'm going to launch something. And that was, I think it was God led and God ordained, but I decided to launch Denver Institute for Faith and Work just after seminary. And got in and started to build something that I deeply believed in, because that was the season I was in, and it was a good season. And I've also realized that God can use anything. He can truly use anything, even my fumbling attempts to serve him early in life. So, but he can use anything. And indeed, he does use his people for his purposes.
Oh, 100%. Dude, I love that. And I really love that you mentioned the critical journey. What and Adam, did you have to read that in school, or was that just one that you read later?
I did, and I didn't like it because I wasn't there yet.
Yeah, right. Oh my gosh.
I was 26, and I was like, this is like psychobabble.
Right.
It's kind of like where I was at. I'm like, oh, come on. And I just wasn't there yet. It wasn't my time for thinking through those things. And so, I'll just say that I wasn't there yet.
Which is totally okay, right? That's just sort of how the journey goes.
That's fine.
And I love, and I really do appreciate that you're like, hey, we respect that season, because that is really important, even though we grew past it. Okay. So what you can see, because you've read the book, is that this whole podcast basically is based on the critical journey. This is where we're going, right? We're going through the whole thing. That's exactly why I started it. I did ask Janet Hagberg if she would come on the show, but she declined me one time. So that's okay.
We can ask again.
It's true. I should ask her again.
We should surround her from a few different levels. I'll help you.
I should. But anyway, that whole thing. So our friends, you can't maybe see that, but every episode is sort of predicated on this idea in this one book, and you should pick it up. I put a link in the show notes. Okay. All right. So you decide. You're knowing and doing. Was there anything that you learned in that season of knowing and doing in like particularly in seminary? Is there anything that stands out to you that like turned out to be either an experience with God or an experience with like when you studied something that really shaped you, that you're like, oh, that kind of changed everything about the way I see the world?
Yeah, and there were tons of great influences in that season of life. So Leslie Newbegin's Missiology, Gospel in a Plural Society, and Foolishness to the Greeks still is influential to me. Today, as I think about how Christians engage culture, that was important. I would also say early career formation and chance to go and do something and to go build something and get feedback and kind of, make my mark on the world, as it were. I do think those were all important parts. And so now I'm a little later, I'm in like my late 20s. But those were all really important. And actually the people that came around me as Denver Institute was starting to grow and were patient with me and kind and gave me feedback, I'm just incredibly grateful for in my life. So each of those were combined with lots of great influences. And I read even more. I read tons of stuff, and I've got zillions of resources on faith and work still there. And that was an important aspect of exploring, okay, what is faith and work? What is calling? But then what does faith look like in all these industries between healthcare and technology and everything in between, and what's the Christian's role in culture? Those were the questions that drove my interest in those kind of early days.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so we'll take us into the story of starting the Institute and like how that happened and what you were wanting to accomplish with it.
Yeah. So I'll get into starting an Institute, and then maybe we'll get to me coming to the wall a little bit.
Yeah.
But so started the Denver Institute. That was my thing, late 20s, early 30s. Yeah, recruited a board, got donors, had enough money, which was hardly any, but enough money to say, yeah, I can support 3 kids on this salary. We're only going to run out in 2 months, and so I did that for a couple of years and built an organization. And we had events and did a leadership development program called the 5280 Fellowship. And again, lots of grace, lots of growth. And it was just a good experience. Had a chance to write for Christianity Today. So I remember the first time I published an article with them, it just was a game changer.
That's
it was
great.
as far as how I felt. It was just a wonderful thing at that time. And I would, fast forwarding a little bit now, even just 3 or 4 years into a 10-year journey of leading that, I would notice what I called in the book cracks in my armor. And the cracks were, I'll give you an example. So the founding story of Denver Institute, my wife was so kind. One day I came home from work, opened the garage door. She rearranged our garage. Half the garage was an office. And she said, Jeff, you can do this. Go build Denver Institute. And I did it. I spent years building it until I realized that something wasn't quite right. So I would, for instance, when we had a big win in the organization, I'd be elated. I'd be over the moon, right? Like, this is amazing. We're making finally a huge impact. When we didn't, when I got rejected or get ghosted or any of those things are still issues for me. If I get ghosted, I felt not only frustrated or a little angry. Occasionally when I had a big loss, I'd felt almost just despair. I remember coming home from work for at least probably 6 months to a year, just exhausted to the point of I would fall asleep like an hour or two before my wife every single night. And as I was like trying to figure out what was going on with both my body as well as sort of my spirit, even like little kids at that time, cute, but I just would sometimes be so impatient and just explode at them. And then I would immediately apologize to them. And I realized that I was doing my work. I knew a lot of stuff. I was having an impact, or at least I felt like I was having an impact at the time, but I had this big white spot on the map. I couldn't see myself. I couldn't see what was going on inside. I couldn't understand why I was responding in certain ways that I knew were not good, but I didn't know why I was doing it.
Yeah.
And so that led me, initially I got involved in my work principally for exterior reasons, making an impact in culture and these types of things, which are still important. But I realized there was a big interior question of not only what is the impact I'm having, but in the process of my work, who am I becoming?
Yeah. Okay. So what you're describing, I'm really interested in this. Partly it's the experience of an entrepreneur, right? Like we're all like that. We all kind of have these like ups and downs, and one day is exciting and the next day it's just, the worst, right? You're like, what's going to happen? But were you finding it more than that? Or were you finding it like you just didn't have skills to deal with it? Or what were you telling?
It was the experience of an entrepreneur, so it was typical. And it was probably, again, typical. I think mostly when we're living our life, we think we're the only one that has this experience. And then when you look back, you're like, oh, everybody had that experience. So it was typical in the entrepreneurial experience of highs and lows. And I think it was also typical in the second respect was we are looking for identity from our work and for making a big impact or imprint. And that was totally true of me. When things were going well, I was still going well. When things were going bad, I was going bad. And Christians can sort of baptize that. Like when I'm making an impact for God's kingdom, then everything is going great, or things are falling apart. I mean, I did that. I baptized sort of my, not only ambitions, but my need to be seen, my need to be important, my need to have a place in my community. That was a very driving one that was sitting right beneath all of my actions, was a sort of a deficit or a need that I was trying to extract from my experience in my community. And it started to short circuit, like a circuit breaker that doesn't work right. It just started to not work very well for me.
Yes. Okay. So I'll come back to your story, but I want to talk about that concept a little bit because I think it's so, we kind of alluded to it earlier. It's so ingrained in American evangelicalism, at least in my experience. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to be a pastor is because that's important, right? It's important
Right.
work. And we all kind of, we kind of sort of do that. I've had friends say to me, "Oh, well, you're the seminary guy, right?" Like that somehow gives me some sort of holiness that I don't
Right.
deserve, right? I don't have, trust me. So I think we put people who do ministry, people who do certain kind of quote meaningful work on this pedestal. But that creates its own pressures, right? It creates its own issues. I think we see that in all the meltdowns that we see, I think, that are happening in the church right now. How do you think about that kind of issue? Certainly having experienced it, but then also I'm guessing with your work, you've addressed this. How do you think about all that?
Yeah. So I do think at least generations in American history, the idea of being a pastor or missionary, that was what made you important in your community. And everybody would say, yes, pastor. Actually, I think in the last maybe 20 years, even in evangelical circles, it's entrepreneur. You launched something, you did something. That's what's important. So the F word,
Yeah.
founder, it becomes really important, and you kind of attach yourself and your identity to that. And that was, I think, very true. And so I think then on the interior journey, it's first, everything is up and to the right. It's exciting. We're creating some obstacles. Things are going well until you realize, oh, this is going to be harder than I thought it was. And then I actually think one of the real challenges, at least with the entrepreneur thing, is you start to see people externally, as you start to grow externally, are saying, look at you go, you're doing great, this is amazing. But on your interior side, let's say you don't know what you're doing, you're kind of lost, you're trying to get too much of your ego from it. You're not even sure if the business or the thing is actually going to function well. And what happens is a sort of divergence between my exterior self and my interior self. And I found that divergence very clear in my life. And I think, but to be fair, that's just a kind of entrepreneurial journey. I see it lots of different ways. So sometimes that divergence is, look at my degrees that I got. I see that a lot in like law world, right? Or sometimes is look at my meaningful work, could be the caring industries, right? Or look how much I'm making. This is what's important. We sort of do this divergence of people cheering you on for your work life, and then Christians can sort of baptize it. But on the inside, we're not healthy because we're trying to get things from our work that we were never supposed to get from our work. And so that was my experience, that divergence. And so go back to it. Yeah, it may be the pastor missionary thing, but when I interviewed people for the book, I didn't hear a lot of people say, I wish I could have done something more meaningful like be pastor, but I heard from several people, I didn't do the entrepreneur CEO thing, and they felt like less.
Oh,
and I thought, that's interesting. That's interesting, because I think that has a control over the imagination, even for what's important and what's meaningful right now. That may not be terribly healthy.
All right. Well, you have me questioning all my life decisions. That's great. Thanks.
Yeah,
Jeff.
no problem.
That's good.
Anytime.
Yeah. Fascinating. Wow. Okay. How should we get our sense of self then, if it's not from our work?
Yeah. Well, I think it comes from Jesus. So I'll go back to my story. I went through this season of just trying to understand, why was I behaving like this, right? Why am I exploding with my kids? Why am I just exhausted, not able to function? Why am I behaving like this at work? The high highs and the low lows. Why was I doing that? And for me, there was a whole season that I had a coworker, a guy named Brian Gray, that was so influential in my life, really helped me with the season of self-awareness. And the self-awareness journey for me was a precursor to what's kind of the first principle in the book, which what I call seek deep spiritual health. I think we need to take a pause from all of our going and building things, take a look at ourselves and take an honest stock of where we're at. And I do think we need to go on a journey of seeking deep spiritual health. And in my view, Eric, a critical element of that self-awareness journey is simply opening ourselves to what is and noticing what's there and not trying to fix it. I think it's an important part of spiritual formation, but just saying, God, this is actually what's going on. I'm getting now for the first time honest about what's happening in my life. I mean, it could be addictions, it could be work stuff, it could be family stuff, but you sort of open it and then open the heart to God. And then I do think there's a lot of, I mean, there's 2,000 years of Christian history of how do we open ourselves to receiving God's life and his love.
Yep.
And one, I put this actually in the end of the book, one image that's been helpful for me is from Bernard of Clairvaux.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Bernard said, what we need to be is reservoirs, not canals. And the image here is a reservoir is filled up with water. And if a little bit trickles over the top, the reservoir is not diminished. But most of our lives, instead, we are canals that whatever we receive, we give out and we're depleted just right that next day. And I think a lot of us live our Christian lives this way too. I got the podcast, went to the church, I received, and then, on the drive home from church, actually, and we're all arguing with each other, it's all depleted right away.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this continual depletion. And Bernard's saying, actually, just hold on with giving your wonderful gifts to the world, and receive God's generosity and his goodness. And I think that sort of position of sort of noticing ourselves, seeing what's there, and opening our hand and receiving. And this can happen through the spiritual disciplines. This can happen in church community. I think that sort of pause of the heart is what sets the foundation for the filling of God's life, which leads to health in every other category: relationships, work, society, economies, culture. I actually think it's all deeply connected to what's happening in our spirit.
Isn't it interesting? It's almost like we're made for Sabbath, made for taking a stop, taking a break.
Absolutely. It's like we were designed to do it one day out of 7. That's right.
Right. Like that's interesting. When we first moved to Colorado, maybe you too, right around that time, Colorado was kind of like Denver was kind of dead on Sunday. Do you remember that? Like you couldn't even buy liquor in the grocery store,
times have changed in Colorado.
You couldn't buy it. Like all the liquor stores were closed, or everything was closed. I remember an Easter where we were like trying to find, I don't know, something we were trying to find to go, like a kite or something, I think maybe. And we couldn't find any place that was open so we could buy a kite because everything was closed. It was just shut down.
Yeah.
And today that would not be the case at all. In, whatever 18 years it's been, it's, and there's a detriment to that, right? Like if we don't take that pause to give ourselves the space to have that kind of reflection.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think Sabbath is one of those critical disciplines that fill us with life. And even to your point, in Colorado, I've got kids and they're all in soccer right now, but we all the time have soccer games scheduled on Sunday morning.
Mm-hmm.
So we as a family are trying to work through like how hard of a line do we set? Where do we set expectations? How do we keep building some hedges around Sabbath so that we have a chance to be restored in life? Like, yeah, I have a portion of that in the book as well about Sabbath practices, but I do think those are just critically important for us to be healthy and whole, to live a Sabbath life. And it's hard to do it sometimes in a culture that doesn't know anything about it.
Right. It fascinates me too how the disciplines never really change, right? They're always pretty much the same thing. And we always come back to even, what you're talking about, taking that time to reflect and whatever, like they're all the same. They're just, we all need them, right? But they're timeless in a way.
Yeah, I had a friend, which maybe someone in your podcast has already said this, but I had a friend that said, what's the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. And he also said that's the definition of spiritual formation.
Yeah.
And it's like, to your point of the same, it's like, you do the same thing, keep on receiving, live a structured life that receives God's grace, and actually the results do change.
Wow. Yeah. That's awesome. Okay. So was that your dark night? Was that your season when you were?
Yeah. And not that it's totally done, but there was a whole season of looking at what does faith and work mean? And it's not only about our impact of the work that we're doing in society and culture and all these other things that I was interested in. It's who we're becoming. I think God is really interested in drawing us into his triune life.
Yeah.
And so from that dark night of the soul, it was just sort of I didn't go through a deconstructing phase because my philosophy and my background wouldn't allow it. But I did have to deconstruct how I lived my Christian life and what it meant to be a person of faith. And there was I would say there's been a few different reemergences from the dark night of just experiences of joy and life that I thought I'd lost, or that I thought maybe those were just for people that had just come to faith, like a new believer sort of a thing, and I can never get it back again. But as it turns out, it's always offered.
Can you give me a story? Is there one that stands out that you're able to share?
For Join Life, yeah. I mean, for instance, that we talked about this before the call, but I'm going to a church called Wellspring here.
Oh, yeah.
And even in the last 3 years, sort of the experience of the Spirit, I think for a long time I would analyze this, like, what are the gifts of the Spirit? Does this make sense? Can we be doing this? And yet I've had the chance in corporate worship to experience God's joy in life just regularly, both during singing, Eucharist, praying with my family afterwards. It's just a different sort of experience of God's life. So I would say that I've experienced little things from morning devotions to sometimes retreats, but it hasn't been a single, like, that's when everything changed. It's been a slow deepening rather than like a single sort of fireworks. I would say that's how my spiritual life has worked out.
I actually love that you said it that way, because I think I think the stories that we celebrate are the ones that have like this dramatic moment to them, right? Or something, right? But it doesn't usually work that way. That's not the way that it goes for most of us. For often, it's slow and over time, and it's a sudden dawning, right? You know?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's actually similar to marriage. I mean, when you get married, there's all sorts of fireworks and joy and love, and that's not to diminish it. It's beautiful, but you don't feel the same way 20 years into marriage that you do after, the first week into marriage. But what you do feel in 20 years that you didn't feel beginning is a deepening of your love for a spouse. It's a deepening of like deeply knowing somebody.
Yep.
And having her know me, that feels much more like even my spiritual life. Yeah, there he is again. Yeah.
Right.
I'm starting to recognize these patterns of God pursuing me with his grace. And so it feels like the marriage covenant of the deepening of love over time, rather than, kind of the only sparks. And sometimes you still, later in marriage, of course, you sometimes still get the sparks too. Right. But the constant is the deepening love.
Right. Right. Boy, that's well said. I like it. Okay. What did you learn about yourself? Did you have to give up any identities and adopt any new identities through going through all that?
Yeah, so my own work story, I actually, after 10 years, I decided to lay down leading Denver Institute. So I'm not doing it anymore.
Yeah.
And the number one reason was this issue was I had exchanged, this is what I wrote in a letter to our board. I had exchanged the caller for the calling. I liked the work so much. I wanted the impact so much that I like spending time with God was just difficult. And I just felt like I was really too wrapped up into it. So yeah, the change for me was laying down. So I said, gosh, this has to change. So I announced to the board, and we did a really good, healthy transition. There's an incredibly talented leader now leading Denver Institute, and there's a couple other reasons why the time was right for a change. The organization was mature, didn't need me in the same way it did in the founding days. But I think that identity piece of there is a time to pick up and there's a time to lay down. This was a time for me to lay down. And the difficulty in that, Eric, afterward is right now I'm not leading anything. Everybody's like, what's your next act?
Yeah.
What are you going to do next? And I'm like, well, I'm working on a few projects for friends. I mean, that's kind of my best answer right now.
Yeah.
And that means I don't get to say, this is my title, this is my thing, this is important. That's exactly where the Lord has me right now. That's just a facade for life. It's not life itself. And so that was where I was at. So I don't hope your listeners don't hear, go quit your job necessarily. I mean, maybe if that's what the Lord's saying, but I do think there does need to be a laying down of what gets in the way. And that could be lots of different things. It could be reputation of my kids or my family or my community or my house, I suppose it could be lots of things depending on what's in the heart. But if you can identify an idol that's truly coming between you and the Lord, the best thing is to crush it. And that can be hard.
Indeed. Wow. You said that very well. I appreciate that. So that's good. Okay. So you moved on. And so now you're kind of seeing what's next and you're writing. So I'm interested. I mean, we've covered, I think, a few things from the book. What do you like? We're talking about working from the inside out. What are you hoping that this is the impact that people will get from this book?
Well, I hope people buy it because they're looking for God's purpose in their work or their working life. And I hope they get on it on the back end, an invitation into a deeper spiritual life that then does influence our work, but also influences our relationships in our family.
Yeah.
I hope they hear an invitation to a deeper satisfaction and a joy that I think the world needs, but I also think that we need as well. So there's lots of different books on faith and work. My kind of choice in this was to recenter it on spiritual formation. And I do think that the invitation is a joyful living with Christ, not just for Christ.
Yes.
In our daily lives. That's a Sky Jitani kind of a quote. So that book is wonderful as well. So that's what I hope people get out of it, is that I actually had a friend send me a nice text. He said, I feel like some of the calcified layers on my soul are starting to come off.
Wow.
That's what I hope. I hope that gets just peeled back a little bit and the heart becomes a little bit more human, a little less hard afterwards.
Amen. Wow. I love that. Okay. So we talked a little bit about how we wrap up our identity with work. We've talked a little bit about how it shapes us, which I deeply love. I'm so glad that you've done that work, because it is so powerful. As Americans who value productivity, who value doing, right? Like thinking and never even considering how it shapes who we're becoming. It's such an important question to even just raise and just be like, hey friends, you have to think about that. Cause I think there's a lot of opportunity for the Lord, to speak into people's lives because of that. Just raising that question. Did you face any like challenges as you were writing the book? Like what was the hardest part to put into words and to bring out?
Yeah, this book actually it wasn't terrible for me because it was a lot of my experiences and knowledge over the last 10 years of work. So it wasn't very difficult in the actual writing process, probably no different than anybody's work challenges that they're listening to this podcast. So I'll just say there were normal things. Trying to actually, I'd say maybe trying to just be honest. It's always hard to be honest.
It's really tough when you're writing stuff, right? To be like, not only just honest, but to not say things in a way that over exaggerates. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. To try to be honest. Right. Yeah. Try to say like something is. And when I know something, great. When you don't know it, that's okay too. Like just to do that. And I do think that is a challenge, not only with writing, but it's a challenge with all of our lives, is to neither denigrate ourselves or to exalt ourselves, but just to see ourselves as we are.
Yes. To embrace reality. That seems to be a theme in my day today. I love that. Okay. One thing I want to touch on, because this is one of the things that actually drew me into online entrepreneurship, is the idea of service to other people. The best thing I think about building an audience is it's all predicated on you knowing who they are and helping them, right? Like serving them. How can I serve you? Yes, we'll get to a point where maybe I can offer you something a transformation that you'll pay me for. But first, I want to serve and help. I think that's deeply. I can't decide if it's Christological, like Christ-like or God-like. I think that's the way that we're made, like to help serve each other. Tell us about how you see that and how that. Because I think the world's a better place when we do it, right? When we serve each other.
No, I'd absolutely say so. There's challenges with work and getting too wrapped up into it, and lots of other ones, underappreciated or underpaid. I mean, there's lots of challenges, but there's a real good thing in work. God created work for us to not only expand and grow creation, cultivate the world. He also, to your point, created us to serve. And so core to, having a podcast audience, you want to serve that person. But that is like the way we make ourselves useful to the world is through work that serves the needs of others, right? So this could be public education. It could be in public service. It could be, working in retail. There's lots of different ways that we can serve others. And I think experiencing the presence of God as we serve others is a gift. And not only thinking about, the end of work as money. Actually, there's one interesting guy I put in the book. His name is Dave Haytag. He cares for, he leads a business called Edgerton Gear, and he works with apprentices in a machine shop. And he has a nice way to put it. He says, money is not the only motivation for my work. It is a part of what we get remunerated for is our work, but it's not the only thing we do it for. So to your point, serving others through our work is incredibly important. And if we do it well, it tends to build a market.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
And it tends to, grow.
And okay, so to go back to our earlier point, you don't ever, it's really every business, is every work, right, is about service, not just ministerial work, right? It's like
everything.
Yeah,
it is an expression of love your neighbor as yourself.
Yes.
If you see your neighbor and you see your neighbor's needs, work is an aspect of doing that. So I think oftentimes we see love God, love your neighbor, and maybe we translate that too quickly to our volunteer activities. Now, we can certainly love our neighbors as ourselves through volunteering, but that should be the framework for all of our work, right? How do I care for somebody else's needs through this work here? And when you do that well, there's a market. There's going to be a market for it. And when you don't do it well, you're not serving a real need, then your business won't do very well.
Right.
Or your clinic or your school or whatever it might be. And then you have to ask again, who is this person that I'm trying to serve and how do I serve them well? So when industries and businesses die, it's because they've lost that. And when they do well, they're continually listening well and caring for the needs of others.
Okay. Well, that's fantastic. Friends, I want you to get the book again. It's Working from the Inside Out, a brief guide to inner work that transforms our outer world. I think the world will be a better place for it. Jeff, I really appreciate you coming and sharing some of these stories. This is stuff I love, so I'm really grateful for it. So is there, people can find you, I should have this link already ready, but people can find you at, where can people find you actually?
Yeah, so jeffhaanen.com is my writing website. That is one place. The book is on Amazon and University Press and other places as well.
Okay, perfect. That's great. I've got links to everything to Jeff in the show notes as well. Jeff, is there anything you want to leave us with?
Receive today. Receive God's goodness. He wants to give it to you. I'll just leave you with that.
That's perfect. I appreciate it. Thanks for being here.
Blessings.